Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Institute of Social and Cultural Studies, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our seminar. We appreciate your presence, virtual presence, at this difficult time. All our accomplished speakers here, Dr. V. Anand Reddy, Director C. Aurobindo Center for Advanced Research, Pondicherry, Dr. Hindol Sengupta, historian, author, journalist, famous biographer of Sardar Patel, Nivedita R. Vide, Vice President, Vivekananda Kendra Kanyakumari, Professor Guillaume Bekarlage from Open University UK. Professor Bekarlage's research has centered on the legacy of Swami Vivekananda and the practice of Seva within the Ramakrishna Mission and Mott. Today's chair, Dr. Vikram Sampath, is a Bangalore-based historian, doctorate from University of Queensland, Australia, and is currently a senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Now, may I request Dr. Vikram Sampath to initiate the webinar.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Viswas. Very good evening to everyone who's joining and all the esteemed speakers on this very, very pertinent topic that we are discussing today. I think in the wake of a problem that all of us as humanity are facing today with the COVID-19. And there's perhaps no longer lasting historical relationship than that between humans and diseases. And strangely, it's a relationship that probably predates even events like, say, agriculture or formation of cities and human migration. Epidemics, quite like wars and natural disasters, have had profound influences on the course of human history, positive as well as negative influences that come about with it. Smallpox, malaria, influenza, they decimated entire indigenous American populations after European contact in the 16th century, thereby paving the way, so to say, of Western colonization of the New World. Scholars like John McNeill have long argued that yellow fever, malaria, epidemics like these have actually helped nations become free. In the campaigns of the American War of Independence, whether it was in Carolina or Virginia, in the Haitian Revolution, in the Caribbean, in the Wars of Independence, in the Spanish Americas, locally born and raised soldiers and militia enjoyed a stronger advantage over European troops in terms of resistance to these infections. And 100 years later, we saw the Spanish flu, which also became a very deadly combatant when it came to the trenches of the First World War. Now, epidemics have contributed to several consequences, mostly unintended. One of them being, of course, a rising sense of protectionism, nativism, racial bigotry, in the sense of wanting to protect yourself against the outbreak. We're seeing a lot of that right now, too. They've also given rise to social upheavals. Samuel Cohn at the University of Glasgow argues that popular revolts blossomed alongside the worldwide outbreak of cholera right from the 1830s through the 1910s. In fact, entire cities in Europe as well as North America were subsumed by what are known as the cholera riots. Now, but it's also on the positive side, it's also catalyzed political movements, particularly of the more radical types. And that can be attributed, I think, to an increased sense of nationalism that emerged with the perception of the colonial masters' complete apathy and unfair dealings when it came to the victims' sufferings. Particularly in India, the plague that ravaged the country in the 1890s could well be described as the very foundation for armed revolutionary movements across India. Maharashtra and Bengal being the two theaters for this to play out in decades to come. The repressive plague measures of the British Raj in the Bombay presidency, the retribution that was sought by the brave Chapekar brothers through the assassination of the plague commissioner there, the arrest of Bal Gangadhar Tilak, whose writings against the plague measures were deemed to be seditious, and the echoes of all of this being heard across the country in Bengal through the Anushilan Samiti, the heroic deeds of Aurobindo Ghosh, Barin Ghosh, Prafulla Chaki, and several others. All these historical events galvanized an anti-imperialistic struggle in India. On the benign side, it also encouraged a sense of selfless service, as was witnessed in the works of the Ramakrishna Mission, where Swami Vivekananda created the Plague Relief Committee with Sister Nivedita as the president and Swami Sardananda as the secretary. And the Plague Manifesto of Swamiji, stressing on what I would call the 3 S's, sanitation, service, and spirituality. I think they are as relevant to us as a country, as humanity today, as we battle COVID. So the unintended impact of diseases and disasters was also in catalyzing the sense of nationalism seen much later in 1913 in the floods of the Damodar River and the relief work that brought a Jadu Gopal in touch with the revolutionary Bagha Jatin. Or we also know how the RSS founder, Dr. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, worked relentlessly with the Ramakrishna Mission to assist flood victims during the Damodar flooding in 1913. All of these kindling a spirit of patriotism and nationalism through service and suffering. Now, history is a far from perfect tool to predict the future. But then if the pattern is anything to go by through all that I just spoke about, I think we are, despite the tough times that we are living in, I think we can be rest assured that we are living in very interesting times. So it's a very broad topic that the Institute has put together, and I congratulate them for conceptualizing this, a very topical theme. And we couldn't think of better, and more equipped speakers on this topic. So I've been told that each speaker would have about 10 to 11 minutes or so, right, Mr. Biswas, to make their comments, and then we could also take questions from the audience. So I've been given an order in which they need to be requested to speak. I'd call upon Dr. Ananda Reddy to make the initial comment.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.
I'm Dr. Ananda Reddy. Well, thank you, Shri Vikram Sampath, and thank you, Mr. Arindam Mukherjee and Dr. Biswas, for inviting me to this beautiful conference, webinar as it is said nowadays, on a very peculiar theme: disease and disasters, growth of early nationalism in colonial India. It's a very fascinating subject indeed. And as Shri Vikram Sampath also mentioned a few examples, I think it's very relevant, especially in the present times, because most of us are thinking, what will happen? What kind of a nationalism will come up after this Corona-19 or COVID-19? And that's why I thought maybe let me put forward a very general view. I'm not going to get into this really topic of the COVID-19, but what is the nature of nationalism that is born out of this stress of disease and disasters? I remember a great French thinker, Ernest Renan, who pointed out in his book, What is a Nation? He says, yes, common suffering unites more than common joy. In respect of the memories of a nation, griefs are worth more than triumph. It is in this light that disease and disasters have often built up the memories of a nation and given rise to national feelings. Common suffering of a nation cements it together and gives it the needed psychological spirit of oneness. It is in this light again that we have to see all the suffering, disasters aroused during the colonial era. I'm not going to repeat all the historic events, but what I see is behind and beyond these disasters and sufferings and disease, there is something more, something that is much more permanent, that gives you a higher intensity of nationalism which persists through the decades. And that force that strengthens the spirit of nationalism is new spiritual thought and usually a new religious activity. So this is what Sri Aurobindo himself writes. There is not just the question of disease and disasters and depression, but always in India it has been that is a new spiritual thought and usually a new religious activity. And we have glaring examples in Arya Samaj, Brahma Samaj, and especially Sri Ramakrishna Samaj. So we see the movements of nationalism that are born out of these three religious movements have really lasted for ages. Of course, as Mr. Vikram Sampath mentioned, there have been great periods of resistance and revolts in India. Well, there, of course, there are countless names which we cannot really put in this short paper. You know, people like Rani of Jhansi, Lakshmibai, and then Abaka Chauta of Uttal settlement of Mangalore, etc., etc. But what I want to distinguish is that all these revolts and resistance to the British rule, or most of them, I cannot say all, were basically having a valor of the Kshatriya, the strength of a warrior, the strength of a queen or a king, the vision of a king. But as it is normally said, Brahmin without the Kshatriya is lame. The Kshatriya without Brahmin is blind. And it is exactly this ideal, the deeper purpose of the freedom of India, the vision of India beyond the freedom that Sri Aurobindo, among many others, had provided to the already boiling situation in the country's freedom movement. What I want to focus on is that there is this question of the vision of why freedom. Is it one more country, India? Is it one more country like other countries seeking a political freedom and for the sake of freedom of the country? Well, most of these people, most of the revolutionaries were doing that. But Sri Aurobindo provides a vision beyond the freedom of the country. And then giving us the importance of why India needs freedom, not only for herself, but for the sake of the future of the earth, for the sake of the future of the world itself. So he adds a bigger dimension, a kind of a universal dimension, a futuristic dimension, but it takes a stand on spirituality, what we call spiritual nationalism. He says nationalism is not a mere political program. Nationalism is a religion that has come from God. And then in another place he says, Mother India is not a piece of earth. She's a power, a godhead. For all nations have such a Devi supporting their separate existence and keeping it in being. In another talk he says, India as a nation is a mighty Shakti, composed of the Shaktis of all millions of units that make up the nation, just as the Bhavani Mahishasura Mardini sprang into being from the Shaktis of all the millions of gods assembled in one mass of force and welded into unity. The Shakti we call India, Bhavani Bharati, is the living unity of Shaktis of 300 millions of people. And in another place, we find a writing from the mother where she says, India is a living being, as much living as, say, Shiva. India is a goddess as Shiva is a god. If she likes, she can manifest in human form. Well, I read out a few of these sayings from Sri Aurobindo, only to emphasize that the nationalism, the spiritual nationalism, is the beginning of a great vision for the future of the country. It is that which gave us the true basis, and this entire freedom movement got a new spur. You see, there have been many revolutionaries, many visionaries who came, but this kind of a new spur for the very raison d'etre of freedom is not freedom for oneself, for the sake of oneself, but freedom for the growth of the entire humanity. Well, that was the first stage, what I call the spiritual nationalism, which had a beautiful mantra, the Bande Mataram. Bankim Chandra's great mantra, Bande Mataram, was the outward expression of Sri Aurobindo gave us the spiritual nationalism. After that, the movement of nationalism became the Kshatriya nationalism. That is when there was the mantra given, Swaraj is my birthright, or the Purna Swaraj. And of this, I would say the great champion was Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, the Kshatriya spirit that was brought in the national movement. And then on the third level, we had the ethical mode. India passed on to the ethical nationalism, wherein we had the satyagraha or the non-violence as a slogan or as a mantra, where the principles of Sri Krishna were not there, but it's more the question of the Madhava Seva is Manava Seva. Well, after these three phases, as all of us know, India gained her freedom and independence in August 1947. But Sri Aurobindo, on his note, just during that period, he commented, the question is what India is going to do with her independence. Bolshevism? Gundaraj? Unfortunately, after her freedom, the country forgot the sacrifices of the martyrs, and gradually, under the banner of secularism, rationalism, and realism, ideals borrowed from the West, its nationalism went into the background, and it came under the sway of the anti-nationalists. But I'm not interested in going into the present movements of nationalism. But I'd like to point out to the listeners one great message from Sri Aurobindo, which is really very relevant to the nation at present. Sri Aurobindo, in his message of 15th August 1947 writes, India is free, but she has not achieved unity, only a fissured and broken freedom. One time it almost seemed as if she might relapse into the chaos of separate states, which preceded the British conquest. But the old communal division into Hindu and Muslims seems to have hardened into the figure of a permanent political division in the country. For if it lasts, India may be seriously weakened, even crippled. Civil strife may remain always possible even a new invasion and a foreign conquest. When I read this again and again, I remember exactly what is happening today in our country. The foreign powers trying to invade, influence, buy up, conquer our country through different means, not a military conquest, but economic conquest. So what Sri Aurobindo had forevision seems to be coming true, but there is also a divine power that is intervening, I feel. Because as Sri Aurobindo wrote, the partition of the country must go, and by whatever means, the division must and will go. Well, this is a prophecy that we have to see when it comes true. But what is important is to see that the great mantra of the Vande Mataram has served us very well to bring us out of the colonial rule. But then in the present times, a new mantra, we have to return to the spiritual nationalism, and then the Shakti has to be reborn in the hearts of the Indians to get a new inspiration, a new form, and lead the world towards a new evolutionary march from nationalism to internationalism, from equality and liberty to brotherhood and spirit. Worship of lesser godheads of money and power will not bring India closer to her destiny. It is Bharat Mata who will shower prosperity and power and perfection in India's material life, harmony and wisdom in a spiritual life. Thank you for the little miss of this time given to me. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. I think that was a wonderful way to begin the seminar today on something that underpins the Indian way of life and the uniquely Indian contribution to the sense of nationalism, which is spiritual nationalism, probably less known or completely unknown in other parts of the world. So thank you for that intervention. I'd now request my friend Hindol Sengupta to make his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for this wonderful seminar. I'm delighted to see all of you. Delighted, of course, to see my old friend Vikram, even though via a computer screen. But very happy to see all of you, and very happy that this is happening in my beloved hometown where I grew up in Kolkata. Always happy to get a slice of Kolkata in my life. So let me begin from that point, ladies and gentlemen. I want to make 3 points, but they are all interlinked, or 3 instances which are interlinked to my core point. I want to talk a little bit about, of course, the Chapekar brothers who have been mentioned by Vikram and others. I want to mention Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna Mission. I'm a child in a sense of the Ramakrishna Mission. I got my Diksha at the age of 10. I'm also the biographer of Swamiji. apart from Sardar Patel. So I'll mention a little bit about the Ramakrishna Mission in those crucial years. And I will also, of course, talk about Sardar Patel, because when you talk about this journey of nationalism and a plague, an epidemic, a great disease, you cannot forget Sardar Patel and his role in the Ahmedabad municipality. That you cannot forget. So these three instances are in a sense tied together. And as the bedrock of all of this is a fourth instance, the great Sannyasi rebellion, which of course gave us Anandamath of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, and of course gave us Vande Mataram. I think there is a strain, there is an idea that is seeded that sort of connects all these ideas, which is that in a time of great medical emergency, which is what a famine or an epidemic or a plague is, there were people who were looking inward rather than only outwards. And I want to take off from what Dr. Reddy was talking about, to make my first point, which is that in each of these instances, whether it's the Sannyasi rebellion, whether it's Patel looking inwards, whether it is Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna Mission, or the Chapekar brothers, I think there is a moment where deeper questions and deeper reflections are being made at a time of great crisis, which is not only about fixing that momentary medical crisis. So there is one part of the journey, which is the momentary medical crisis. But I think all of these great men are in fact, and indeed women, are in fact taking a moment to look at what are the deeper crises, as it were, in their society at that time. It is easily forgotten today, ladies and gentlemen, that the Ramakrishna Mission in its early years was looked upon by the British authorities as a potentially seditious organization. Today, the benign and the genteel Ramakrishna Mission that all of us know, we have forgotten that Ramakrishna Mission's propagation, for instance, of the Bhagavad Gita was seen by British authorities as deeply seditious. In fact, Swami Vivekananda himself was on many British registers as somebody to watch carefully and whose activities needed to be tracked. So when a moment of crisis appears, Swami Vivekananda takes a moment to not only work, to not only to provide seva, but also to reflect upon the country that of which he is a citizen. He reflects on how the disease is not the only crisis, but there is a deeper crisis of national self-esteem, of collective confidence, of deeper self-worth. This is exactly, ladies and gentlemen, the kind of reflection that we see in the Chapekar brothers. Because after all, why did the Chapekar brothers decide on that fateful day, or that fateful night, should I say, to kill Rand and Ayerst? Let me just get the name absolutely right. Ayerst, yes, Lieutenant General Ayerst and Walter Charles Rand. Why did they decide to kill these two men? Walter Charles Rand, of course, had just been appointed as the chairperson of the Plague Committee. So they killed these men because not only because of the sort of colonial yoke that India was under, but actually of a deeper crisis of self-worth. If you look at the records, their arguments talk of British authorities using the epidemic to humiliate Indian women, men, and children, often who are being stripped naked in the name of being searched and checked for plague in their homes, their possessions thrown out and destroyed, their entire self-worth being destroyed and diminished through the process of fighting plague, quote unquote. And these men decide to have a deeper self-reflection that, well, health, at the end of the day, when an epidemic comes, what are we looking for, ladies and gentlemen? We're looking for health. But the Chapekar brothers are telling us that health without self-dignity means nothing. Your health is intrinsically connected to your deeper self-worth. Your health is deeply connected to your self-esteem, to your self-confidence. If your dignity is diminished, then merely fighting disease is not enough. And I think that lesson is so valuable even today, that merely fighting disease through medicine is not enough if your very dignity is assaulted. Let's go to Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. If you look at Patel's work during the plague, once again, we're confronted with the plague in Ahmedabad. Anybody who's read even a little bit about Patel knows that Patel took this opportunity to really take on the British authorities during his time in the Ahmedabad municipality. And even when plague came to Ahmedabad, Patel was suggested, one can assume perhaps not always very gently, by many people, including the British, to leave the city. But Patel was wiser and cleverer and wilier than that. He knew that to give up a front line is to give up a position of self-respect and self-esteem. Patel worked through the plague, questioning British authorities at every point, ensuring that not only is the disease fought, but in fact, deeper questions about governance is asked, because he knew, and this is repeated again and again because he mentions it later in his life, he knew that once a population begins to ask deeper questions of governance, ladies and gentlemen, they cannot but land up asking deeper questions of the government, so to speak. And at that point, of course, it meant the questioning of the colonial authorities. These connections, when a stupefying disease like a plague or even a coronavirus today comes upon a population, it tends to, in a sense, bewilder them in a sense. And I'm sure all of us locked in our houses have felt that from point to point, even today. It bewilders you because you lose sense of your bearing. But what we learn from the lessons of these great people are that they took this moment not only to offer seva and service, but also to go beyond their own insecurities to ask deeper questions about the status of the collective. The status of the collective is very important. Let's talk about Swami Vivekananda for a moment. Most people don't know why the British were so worried about Swami Vivekananda. Was it just because he was talking about the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads and the Vedas? No. Swami Vivekananda famously is said to have met one of the most well-known Swiss makers of armament of that time. And Swami Vivekananda chose not to take that path of armed revolution, but he chose a higher path in a sense. He chose the path of spiritual renaissance. But the revolutionary in Swami Vivekananda, in his ideas, in his thoughts, in his urging of the population, is unmistakable. It has a revolutionary fervor. It is just that his revolution, it begins with an inner revolution. He's not talking about an outer revolution alone. And therefore, Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna Mission's work also provides great insight into how to use this moment of a great crisis and disease to contemplate deeper issues of nationalism. But of course, Swami Vivekananda, in a sense, is so much more recent than the sannyasi revolution and the rebellion, where monks, ascetics, are going from village to village to fight tyranny in a moment of great famine. For some of us who have read Anandamath, we cannot but remember those stirring descriptions of poverty and famine and hunger in the Anandamath. You cannot miss it. There is a reason why this fervor is so unmistakable in Bankim Chandra's description of that moment, because the utter deprivation of that moment is so stark. And yet, when you read Anandamath, what are they saying? They're saying, yes, your belly has to be full, But when your belly is full, may you rise to ask a deeper question about your self-worth and towards freedom. This towards freedom bit, of course, is very, very important. Because, of course, the moment you start asking questions about moving towards freedom, you are firmly on the grounds of nationalism. And this is very important. So this thread of asking deeper questions in a moment of crisis of national self-worth, collective self-worth, actually connects the stories from the Sannyasi rebellion right up to Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, passing through the Chapekar brothers, Vivekananda, and they have a valuable lesson to teach us at this moment. And I feel, especially about the crisis that we are facing at our borders today, in a sense, this lesson cannot be more valuable than it is today. We are being asked once again, are we only going to merely fight a disease, or are we going to truly make us free from actually freeing our economy, becoming Atmanirbhar in every way, becoming less dependent, and freeing our self-worth? That, ladies and gentlemen, to me, is the relevance of these wonderful instances in our history to our moment today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hindol. And I think there couldn't be a better way in which one could connect so many seemingly disparate, characters of history dispersed across time spans of 2 centuries, and then pegging that down to the exact nib of what we face today as a nation in the difficult times that we have. So thank you so much for that intervention. And I think your talk on Swami Vivekananda is a nice segue to our next speaker, Srimati Nivedita Bhide, who would specifically elaborate more on the work of the Ramakrishna Mission during the time of the plague. So over to Srimati Nivedita Bhide.
My namaskar to you all. It is really a very apt topic that we have taken, and we also had a very good beginning, and a very good span is put in front of us by both the speakers for further discussion, sharing, and contemplation. You know, as it was put, India is a spiritual nation, is a cultural nation. With such tremendous diversity, there is a very deeper cultural unity, as it was put by Vincent Smith. Because of thousands of years of invasions, the British rule, continuously person was only worried about the self-defense, self-protection. So when they self-defense, and somewhere the business became it went into the background. And it is in such situations that the disasters or diseases suffering are intense. Now, just because the diseases and disasters strike, it's not that you will feel that oneness. There, a critical mass of people have to come forward to give that experience of oneness. They come forward, they serve, they are ready to put everything aside, and it is that experience which a common man takes, and somewhere, even in his inner world, the nation gets the primary importance. That experience takes place. Same thing happening during the plague, when in 1899 the plague struck Calcutta. The committee was formed. Swami Sadananda was the executive director, since was its secretary. And Swami Vivekananda wrote a plague manifesto. It's very interesting to read that whole plague manifesto. It starts with this: when you are happy, we are happy. When you suffer, we suffer. It starts with that. And then Swamiji gives so many things. In that, everything comes. He talks about cleanliness. He says that give up the fear. If you are fearing that
some issue with the network of Srimati Bhire. Dr. Bishwas, are you there? Is there somebody who would be able to get in touch with her and figure that out?
Try, please try. I will try.
Yeah. So I think by the time we get
next
yes.
speaker.
Yeah. So but till we probably fix the issue with Srimati Bhire, I request Professor Beckerleg to make the intervention on this very important issue.
I'm very sorry.
Oh,
where I am, the network is very weak.
Okay. Thank you. Good to see you back.
So Swamiji in this Plague Manifesto, he says that it is the will of the mother, which we have to understand and face the situation. Then he says, you are not alone. If you have any difficulty, you come to the servants of Sri Bhagwan Sri Ramakrishna and they will give you all the help. So it is that experience that we are not alone. It is that experience that, my suffering is not only my suffering. It is the sufferings of so many in the society. And when we talk of oneness, that oneness has to be experienced. And this is given through the service. And that is what happened. We see that this committee which was formed and Nivedita was in the foremost. As we all know, that Sister Nivedita had captured that spirit of nationalism which Swami Vivekananda had awakened in our country. And later, she worked only for that. She used to say that my work is to rouse the national consciousness. Now, that Nivedita has started the Indian society. And this service during this disease and disaster time, that is during the plague time as well as during the floods and famines, the way Nivedita had worked, Nivedita got accepted. And not only accepted, she fired the imagination of the youth that someone coming from outside, if she can work for our society, this is my society. If I don't work for it, this is my, if I don't work for it, who actually, so when the youth of Calcutta, they came forward, they started working. And so it is to all that, a bond was created, as was mentioned earlier. Really, there were some young revolutionaries who even later joined as monks. I am here, that one book is there, in that very detailed description is given. So, Swami Vivekananda's intense love for India, its experience that the people got through the service activities, and further carrying that work by Sister Nivedita later, that gave rise to nationalism amongst the youth. Now, when any disaster strikes, whether it is an individual, whether it is a society or a nation, if it has its inner strength, actually it recognizes the opportunity hidden in that difficulty. If it has no inner strength, it just falls down, it breaks. But if it has inner strength, it makes use of that disaster, and then it creates, because when you respond to one situation, that is, you respond to the problems, the diseases, when you respond to one situation, the response does not get limited to the one field. So then all walks of national life get opened. And that is how the work during disaster or the diseases actually promotes nationalism. Because then it is not limited only to contain the disease or only to serve the people who are in that. But ultimately the question comes that why is it so? Why the government is so callous? Why the government is committing atrocities? Or why the disease has struck itself? So in these basic questions, as the society goes, it starts responding to the situation, and the opportunity hidden in the difficult situation is actually seized. So this is what has to happen even now. That is when we are faced with a very unparalleled situation in the life of all of us. That is, the whole world is reeling under Corona, and we do not know how long it is going to happen. During lot of realization is coming, financial systems are going to become toxic. So the rebuilding of the nation can take place if the thinking, creative minority in the sense, as Arnold Toynbee talked about the world history, and he says that culture, generally the culture rises, it is at the peak, and then it degenerates, and then it is lost. But when it is in degenerating state, if some critical mass comes up and it responds to the situation from a spiritual point of view, and deepening its basis, its foundation, then that culture again comes up. That's what Arnold Toynbee talks. So even in this difficult situation, a creative minority will have to play the role that for rebuilding of the nation. That is, we must have a vision how we come out of this. And it is really good that a lot of discussion is going on, and even the seminar, webinar also is for that. So with this, I think time is up, so I can.
Yeah. Thank you, madam. And I think your voice, despite the troubles of the network and the internet booming from across the tip of the country, right at the southern tip from Kanyakumari, if I'm not mistaken, that's where you were joining in from. It was great to hear you, and I think it was a nice segue into what Hindol mentioned about self-worth. So that sense of self-worth also spurring us as a collective, as a nation, to action and looking for opportunities that may arise. I think that came across very sharply in what you presented.
Please call any question from audience.
Yeah, so we've heard, I think, a vast array of views from three eminent speakers. So I'd certainly like to invite discussions and questions from the audience, please, if anyone has questions. So what's the process, Dr. Biswas? Do they need to type in their question in the chat box, or?
Yes, from
Okay.
the chat box.
I think it's always the issue of who bells the cat first. So let me perhaps do it before I think people get the comfort to type in their questions. And I'll probably ask Hindol, as somebody who's also worked so intensively on issues related to nationalism, Hindol, the very fact that we're talking about nationalism, where do we also put the counters and checks of it slipping into chauvinism and jingoism? Because as I mentioned right at the beginning, the other extreme that also exists is this kind of nativism and protectivism that comes about, with the outbreak of epidemics and so on. So it's a very fine balance that we need to maintain between these two extremes. So how, in your view, does one do that in a situation like this?
Thank you, Vikram. I think that's a great point. Let's look at our moment today, right? And connect it to what, or many of the characters from history we were talking about. Please remember, Swami Vivekananda, he was a great nationalist, but he was not a nativist or a chauvinist. I think that's a very important distinction to make. He was a man who embraced the world, but on his own terms. There is one thing to slavishly imitate the world. There is quite another thing to actually embrace the world on your own terms. And I think this is something worth remembering, because, for instance, today, in our particular moment of crisis, it's very easy to ask for, blanket stoppage of this and that. But many things are far more nuanced, right? And if we truly wish to be truly nationalistic and stand on our own feet and be Atmanirbhar, the thing to do is to increase our strength from within. Merely keeping out the world doesn't make us stronger, but building ourselves to be strong enough to face the world on our own terms is genuinely something that makes us stronger, nationalistic, and truly Atmanirbhar. This, I think, is a very important but often not enough discussed lesson. Isolation doesn't make you stronger. Inner strength makes you stronger, if you know what I mean. It is very easy to drop the drawbridge and close the door or close the gate. Especially, of course, at a time when we are literally having to close the door and stay at home,
Yeah.
But even I would argue at a time when we are literally having to close the door, our mind should remain even more free. And that is the lesson from our history. This impetus to keep your mind free, right? So it's important to build our own strength and not merely
Dr. Sampath,
Yes.
please open a chat box, especially second question. Here is two questions.
Yes. Yeah, I have. So I think this would be addressed to Dr. Reddy. It's an interesting question where, India's strength being her spiritual underpinning that we've had as a civilization, and you spoke about spiritual nationalism. But how then, in the course of our freedom struggle particularly, did we get tied up only to political nationalism and the spiritual nationalism aspect of it, either during the freedom struggle and particularly and more regrettably maybe after freedom? The famous speech of Sri Aurobindo that you mentioned, we lost sight of that in our national consciousness as a country after freedom. So could you tell us a little more about where did this rupture happen, where we gave up spiritual nationalism and our conceptualization of that for the sake of political?
See, in India, our concept of nation is not a nation state. That is, you have one religion, you have one language, you have one agency which rules. That's not our concept. If we see, it is our outlook towards the life. How do we view the existence? What we aspire in human life? What are the values that come from that aspirations? If we take all these questions, then in spite of such tremendous diversity, we see all over India, it is same. That is, you go anywhere and ask that how do you view a human being or this nature? And all will say that, God is everywhere. So God is within, God is without, He is in nature. This question invariably we will get. Then the darshan difference. Secondly, ultimately, human being has to have mukti. So we talk of mukti. Then all our Vedic prayers, so a celebrated Gayatri prayer, it's all about we. Hyo Yona Prachodaya. That we consciousness is there since the Vedic. So as Aurobindo puts it very beautifully, he says it was same culture, was the same dharma, practice of dharma, but the political needs were varied. When it was first time, Chanakya, who said, when there is organized attack on our country, then we also need to organize politically. And he was the one who first did it. And today we know that that is one political route is important because we have to face any organized forces. Now coming to why it became only political nationalism. During just before the freedom, of course, as Sri Aurobindo talks about how India has to guide the world, or Sanatana Dharma is the nationalism. It's not, the nationalism is our dharma. He says Sanatana Dharma is our nationalism. Swami Vivekananda even gives a rousing call to Hindu nation. Mahatma Gandhi talks of Ramaraja. So all along it was spiritual nationalism. But when the British were leaving and when the Muslim League started asking for the separate country, in order to accommodate them, we wrote the objective for directives. The directive objectives what our constituent assembly wrote. They are very vague and so to say accommodate others. To about others means the spirit of India or the spirit of our spiritual nationalism, it went into the background. And that is how, and unfortunately, after the decision was taken, but these directives, this objectives reservation, we did not change. So our whole constitution will come back. So we have to accommodate others, but the real nation, that is, there is one very beautiful article here with Sri Ravindranath Tagore. It is History of Bharatavarsha. And in that he says, in spite of so many inventions that were happening, what was happening in the homes? You are talking of the cyclones that were happening outside. But in spite of those cyclones, what continued in the Indian homes, that is the real history of India. And what was that? It was always the pursuit of one. How the one manifested, how the one manifests in different ways of worship. So we worship differently, we worship the same. So the pursuit of oneness, it is the spiritual pursuit, that is real history of India. But unfortunately, after we became independent, because earlier we had objective resolution, so to say, so universal to keep India together, that is the Muslim League.
I think we kind of gathered the sum and substance of what Srimati Bhide was mentioning, and I think she started with a very pertinent, statement of India became probably a political being, a nation state, a republican nation state in 1947, 1950. But then the Rashtra Purush that India has been, the civilizational impact of India, which is time and time again being questioned all the time now too, in these debates around nationalism, saying, what is the concept of India? It was the British who unified us and gave us the sense of nationhood. We were just a group of warring tribes and kings and chieftains who were at each other's throat. There was no sense of nation state and so on. So a political nation state is a different being compared to a civilizational nation state. And in that, I think we don't need to go any further, but to our own, Vishnu Puran dating back to maybe 1000 BC, where it says, Uttaram yat samudrasya himadraschaiva dakshinam varsham tad bharatam nama bharati yatra santati. So it clearly defines even the sacred geography of the land mass between the Himalayas and the oceans being Bharat, and its children, the Santati, are called Bharatiyas. So, and all of us who see, in our worship, the Sankalpa that is done also in the pujas, the entire Jambudvipe, Bharatavarshe, Bharatakhande, Shakabde, Meroho, Asmin, Dakshine Parshve, all of that, it actually talks about the same sacred geography of India. So it is highly puerile and also futile to argue that nationalism and the concept of a nation state was a colonial gift to us, so to say. Now, there's an interesting question that's come about, which is, and I think Hindol would be well suited to take this up. So can the idea and relevance of spiritual nationalism that Dr. Reddy and Srimati Bhide spoke about, does this actually have relevance, and how do you think that can reach out to particularly our young people today, to students today, and how does one make that popular, so to say, among the youth?
Vikram, I'm of the opinion that there's never been a better time, and an audience has never been more ready, in a sense, in our lifetimes than they are today to absorb this message. Let me tell you why. Well, for the first time in our lifetimes, at least, there is a global movement to embrace meditation. So much so that there are meditation apps with multiple millions of downloads, so to speak.
So we're doing this on the Hindol. We're doing this on the eve of the International Yoga Day, just to interject.
Indeed. So and yoga has never been more famous around the world. That's one of our Prime Minister Narendra Modi's great achievements. Not only did he propel it to global stage, but the world was also ready. The world is ready more than ever before after COVID-19 to hear the lessons of what they call preventive, medicine or preventive health.
Are all the speakers and their internet being hit by a new kind of virus? These are
interesting question from AM Diwakar. Dr. Sampath,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
very interesting question, A.M. Diyakar.
True, but we need the speakers as well. So I think that is also equally important. Hindol, can someone probably call him or so and check if he's still around? Because I see that his internet might have given up. So yeah, I
Hindolji
think
can refresh, excuse me, Hindolji can refresh his link so it might connect better.
no, but unless you call him and tell him that, I think
Okay.
it will be.
Okay, we are calling.
He's written to me saying my internet connection collapsed. So maybe he's coming back in a few moments. So yes. So in the meanwhile, I think there's this question of by Mr. Divakar about research papers linking crises like these and revival of nationalism. I think they're I'd probably take that up in terms of, there's this paper by I.J. Katanak from the University of Canterbury, who's written about the plague and the politicians of Pune. So, which talks in detail about how the plague epidemic, which hit Pune in 1896, and which is what led to the whole incident of the Chapekar brothers, which in turn, fueled what I've covered in my book on the biography of Veer Savarkar, how it inspired a 13 or 14-year-old Savarkar who was seeing all of this happening, the execution of the Chapekars, to go and actually sit in front of the idol of the Ashtabhuja Bhavani in his house. And that links so nicely to what Dr. Reddy spoke about, the Shakti in our country. I think the very fact that in all of this, whether it was Bankim Chandra, as Hindol mentioned, invoking the spirit of Durga, whether it was Bhavani in Maharashtra, right from the times of Shivaji, the divine feminine as the spirit of the country, as the spirit of a fight, and also all these epidemics also being given, you have them as goddesses, right? You have for smallpox, for chickenpox in different parts of the country, you have them as goddesses. So a Savarkar going in front of a Bhavani and saying, "Shatrus Marta Marta Mare to Zunzen," I'm going to fight till my last breath and kill the enemy and not die myself, but actually kill the enemy. And that becomes history in itself with the formation of the Abhinav Bharat, the Mitra Mela and all of that, and how they interlink with the Anushilan Samiti. So a lot of all of this is discussed by I.J. Katanak in this paper. There's also a paper that's written, I think, by, if I'm not mistaken, by Dinyar Patel, who's assistant professor of history in the University of South Carolina, who talks also about various impacts of epidemics. Samuel Cohn, from whom I mentioned in my opening remarks, a professor of the University of Glasgow, also talks about the social upheavals that epidemics like these brought about, the cholera riots, how in Ukraine in 1892 an entire city of Donetsk was actually burned down, by the rioters, because there had to be this collective vent. So there can be two aspects: either it leads you to an inward search, like some of the speakers mentioned, inward search not only for oneself but also a collective, a political, spiritual sort of a resurrection. It can also lead to this frustration, which is coming out today, perhaps in the US, what we are seeing, people on the streets for various causes. So protest, social upheaval. So Samuel Cohn talks about a lot of that. I would also perhaps, refer to I don't know where I've written this. It'll come. Valeska Huber, a historian at the Freie Universität of Berlin, who talks also about how the positive impact of epidemics also being a sense of globalization, where in fact today sitting, locked up in our houses and with international borders being sealed, and when there's no flights taking off between nations, it seems we have gone on a reverse globalization. But then Valeska argues that it led to avenues of global cooperation. The first international sanitary conferences that began in 1851, it brought together diplomats as well as medical experts across the world. And this was the first attempt, so to say, to tackle the problem of propagation of the disease through international cooperation, almost a precursor. We're talking of 1851, so precursor to the World Health Organization, and how different countries can come together in a common cause of trying to beat the epidemic. So there are many such papers which have been written, but unfortunately, again, the uniquely Indian perspective to that, and what have been the Indian responses, political response, spiritual response through service, I think those are lacking. And I think this is an opportunity not just to look at the past, but I think just perhaps what the RSS has done during not only now during the COVID times, but the Seva Bharati and various organizations, the yeoman service that has been done, largely low profile, largely unnoticed, away from all the shor sharaba of the media and so on. I think that it deserves, I think, several papers in itself, whether it's floods or earthquakes and so on. They are the selfless, Swayam Sevaks who are at the forefront and leading right from, as I mentioned, Dr. Hedgewar and his whole, service during the 1913 Damodar River floods. It's an unbroken tradition, so to say, till 2020. I think that needs a lot more documentation, a lot more academic study compared to the usual, the calumny that is spread against the RSS all the time. So that is what I hope, Mr. Dibakar. Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you. If I can, with your permission, may I finish the comments I was making?
Yes, yeah, we were waiting for you to come back, Hindol. I was just stepping in.
My apologies. Suddenly my internet connection went. No, all I was saying is, thank you very much, Vikram. All I was saying is, there has never been a better opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. The world is ready to listen to the Indian lesson of spiritual nationalism. The world is ready for our science and technology. The world is ready for our technologies of creating or bettering our inner self. We have to ask ourselves the question, are we telling our story well? Are we creating technologies that the world can take from us? Are we creating techniques that can become universal? I would ask, why is the Headspace the best known meditation app in the world? Why was it created by a British person and not an Indian? I would say it was a natural no-brainer for an Indian to have created it, right? And the same thing, I mean, it's not only about people who work in technology. The question is also for writers of history, people like Vikram and me. Are we doing enough to tell our story better, right? I think this is a great opportunity, and the world is ready for our lesson, right? And our history and our techniques. I think we must take this opportunity post-COVID-19, whether it's preventive healthcare like yoga and Ayurveda or meditation, whether it's new ideas of cooperation and collaboration, multi-ethnic cooperation and collaboration, how can societies coexist together? All these ideas India can teach the world. It just needs better storytellers, better technology people, better people who can take all these ideas and disseminate them well, quite like Swami Vivekananda once did across the world. This is our great opportunity. That's all I want to say.
Yeah. Thank you, Hindol. And I think I also must mention what Dattaji has written in the comments, where he also talks about Madhushree Mukherjee's book on Churchill's Secret War, the British Empire and the ravaging of India during World War II, which is again I missed my mind. There is another question which I think we could have both Srimati Bhide and Hindol talk about, because by Mr. Basu, where the question is, we all know that during the time period of 1905 to 18, during the nationalist movement, the world was hit with Spanish flu and Bombay fever. How the pandemic actually affected the movement, and what about the media coverage of that time period? I think that is interesting to see. Would any of you want to take that up? Srimati Bhide or Hindol?
Yeah, I was just waiting for Srimati Bhide if she wanted to take that.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat the second part? The connection is not very. Could you just finish or repeat the second part of the question again?
So the question is about the world being hit by Spanish flu during the World War times, and at that time the nationalist movement was also raging in India. So how did this pandemic actually affect the Indian national movement, and what was the media coverage at that time period? As a ace journalist, I think you should take that up about how were they fake news even then, and over exaggerating numbers or suppressing numbers, so to say, was that happening then as well? As
It's very important to notice here, and I'm glad we're on the point of media, not just about the Spanish flu, but please remember, here's one striking part of our national movement which we often forget. Almost every major figure of the Indian national movement, there was one thing common between all of them. Almost always they started a newspaper.
Yeah.
You have to ask yourself, why were they all so determined to start a newspaper? What was going on, right? Clearly, it was because otherwise the news that was being served through official channels of the British was often fake news, or often news that only the British wanted, the people of India to hear. So whether it was the Spanish flu or any other sort of, idea which would impact the legitimacy of the British government was percolated down to the nationalist newspapers that all these people ran. And I think that's a great, lesson. And in fact, that is also tied to our moment today. As many of us know, media is in deep crisis today. But as many old legacy brands in media collapse, the market is being opened up for new ideas to emerge. And that new ideas, me and a colleague of mine have started a new foreign policy platform called New World Order to talk about rising India. And I urge all of you here who are interested in media, it's never a better time than today to start your own media venture, because the internet has democratized many things, and the faith and trust in legacy brands is lower than ever before. So please look at it as an opportunity.
I think this is there's another question that is very interesting and I think topical. So which we usually perhaps underestimate the whole aspect, and I think Srimati Bhide might be well placed to take this if she's interested. So it's about the whole concept of well-being, and it's just been a week since we've had a very tragic, suicide of a famous actor, and a lockdown, this uncertainty that all of this brings up about it puts into focus again, and something that is highly underrated of mental health and mental health issues when it comes to us as a country. We are one of the most depressed nations in the world, with one of the highest suicide rates, which is very sad. It's a time bomb that is ticking. 1 in every 5 Indians, the statistics say, is depressed or is on the trying to contemplate ending his or her life. And for such a scenario, we just have across the country about 9,000 psychiatrists and psychologists, which is highly abysmal. So this from a country which has always spoken about health in a holistic manner, well-being and health, like Hindol mentioned, yoga, Ayurveda, all of these, we're looking at health not in the Western conception of fixing, a bone here or a joint there, but a mind-body connection that we look at, in our approach to health. So what is the increasing role or the Indian, answer for the worldwide interest in well-being as a concept, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being, so to say? Srimati Bhide?
She is out of network.
So Hindol is my only crutch. So I'll toss that question on to Hindol. So Hindol, would you like to talk about this, maybe? The increasing interest worldwide in well-being and the Indian, answer to well-being, not only as physical well-being, and particularly in these times of isolation, uncertainty, depression, all of this that we're facing.
No, absolutely. I actually think, and I have strong views about this, I actually think there are many strengths about Indian society, or, in Indian society. And we are very fortunate to have a very well-knit society, a strong family system, and so on and so forth. But I think we have not done enough contemplation on what are the psychological pressures that our society, or including our family system, might be putting on us. And I actually blame the fact that we were so impoverished for so long. And therefore success, we used to discuss this all the time when I was at Fortune. that one of the biggest problems of Indian entrepreneurship is Indians don't know how to fail properly. And learning how to fail is the first step of entrepreneurship. If you're ever going to be an entrepreneur, you have to learn how to fail. And that's something the Americans do really well. They know how to fail. You try a project, it doesn't work, you move on. But I think there's too much pressure because we were poor for so long. And because this urge to, succeed no matter what, I mean, all of this is changing. But, I grew up in a Calcutta where the only choices for a young male student was that you took science and then tried your best to crack the joint entrance examinations to engineering or medicine. There was very few other options available for middle-class parents to propel their children towards. I got lucky. I moved out of Calcutta. I discovered one could actually do journalism and make a living. All sorts of other things happened. But that was all. I was very, very lucky. So I actually think some of these problems go away once the country starts to become prosperous. And I think we are now at that stage where we must have a really clear discussion in our society on how we can give more freedom to people to choose the lives that they want. Let me give you one example, Vikram. For no rhyme or reason, for most of independent India's history, we suffered a colonial law against homosexuality, right? What was the reason for us to suffer that? I mean, I shudder to think how many people's psychological and emotional, stress and harm must have been created because of this. So there are many things like this which we don't have to suffer, which was British legacy, socialist legacy, impoverishment of our imagination, culture, society, family life. We don't have to suffer these things anymore.
Yeah.
We must actively work to make ourselves free. And if we genuinely talk about the Hindu way of life, remember the Hindu way of life finally promises freedom. So if we can't even make people free in society, how do we hope to make them free, in the ultimate way of approaching God, right? So we must move towards greater liberty. We must move towards greater freedom. I am not surprised the statistics that you're quoting that Indians and their proclivity towards suicide and one of the most mental health problems in the world. Well, it's still a taboo in India to go see a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
I mean, many people might still think, you must be mad or some strange thing like that, right? We must break these. I mean, the amount of pressure that technology and modern life is putting on us, seeking help, whether it's through a guru, whether it's through a medical professional, it's not taboo at all. When you get flu, you go to a doctor and he gives you medicine. When you feel mental pressure, you must be able to go to a doctor. So all of this, I think, needs to be cleared up now. I think, as more and more, as something as fundamental as yoga can help. If you practice yoga, diligently every day, your mind, body, spirit becomes better.
Right.
And we need to really, it has been proved, for instance, by many scientists that chanting of Sanskrit shlokas is very beneficial for your mind, for your state of health of your mind, right? But if you say, let's teach at least fundamental shloka chanting in our schools, everybody will say this is not secular, right? And this is the problem. Right? So any solution in India always gets complicated. I think we should break the barriers of these issues and really embrace the treasures that we have and make ourselves a healthier society. I am absolutely in agreement with you. Sushant Singh Rajput's death is a warning symbol, a warning sign for all of us.
Yeah, that's very well put and a nice way to probably conclude in the interest of time. Thank you, Hindol. And I think as you said, we probably find problems for every solution rather than the other way around. And your comment on the whole introduction of chants, even Vedas, the yoga in schools being opposed, etc. I think that's symptomatic of the same disease. So I think summing up, we've had a melange of views from different speakers. It is that while we can look at the current times as that of crisis, and which they are, and I don't think in our nation's history we've had so many crises hitting us at the same time, and It's only, I really shudder to think about the political leadership of the country today, which is having to brace itself to fight so many battles, so many fronts. It's not just the epidemic that's being fought. There's a real battle being also waged at all our frontiers with several neighbors, relations gone sour, the economy gone on a tailspin, unemployment, then there are issues of individuals, and cyclones hitting on and off across east and western coasts. So it is, at the face of it, it probably looks like the worst of times that we've probably faced as a country and as a society. But I think, as Hindol mentioned, these also need to come, and Dr. Bhide also mentioned this, that these need to come in as very unique opportunities where we look at ourselves, our self-worth, both collectively and the individual self-worth in terms of our health, our well-being, and use the unique Indian way, Indian answer to these problems. I think India has a very unique perspective and a philosophy and a way of life, which has been for the longest time been highly underrated and brushed under the carpet. And this is the time. So Atmanirbhar need not just be confined to the economic realm of production, supply chain, markets, and so on, which of course it needs to be, where Make in India becomes the mantra of the time, but also alongside our unique Indian answer culturally, spiritually, and to the whole to the crisis that the world and humanity faces. I think that is the opportunity that is standing at our doorstep, where the whole idea of being a Vishwa Guru is right now. If now we can show a path to the whole world as to how to deal with crisis like this on various fronts, I think we'll have attained that status of Vishwa Guru. So thank you once again of course, first of all, thank you to Dattaji for introducing me to Mr. Arindam Mukherjee, to Mr. Mukherjee, Dr. Biswas, everyone else at the Institute. Thank you for inviting me to this very, very fascinating and very timely, I think, topic, which we've deliberated in the last hour and a half.
Now, may I request Mr. Krishnendu Bakshi, on behalf of Institute of Social and Cultural Studies, for vote of thanks.
Yes, I just want to, before Mr. Bakshi starts, I also want to, say a big thank you to all of you and for this wonderful institute. And thank you to Dattaji. Dattaji, once again, as he often is, the glue that joined us all together. And thank you, Dattaji, for introducing me to this wonderful institute. Thank you for helping me, participate in this wonderful program, and for helping me meet my old friend Vikram Sampath across the screen once again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, hello. May I request Mr. Krishnendu Bakshi, on behalf of Institute of Social and Cultural Studies, for vote of thanks.
Hello. Okay.
Okay.
So today we have come to the end of this program. I think we are organizing a series of such programs, and it is our third program in this series. And I'm thanking Dr. Vikram Sampath for wonderfully chairing the program and coordinating the all the speakers. We are also thankful Dr. Reddy, Sri Vikram Sengupta, and Srimati Nivedita Bhide for wonderfully presenting their presentation. And also we are thankful to the technology that during this lockdown period, with the help of this technology, we are able to organize our program and continue our activity. But still, as we know that in technology sometimes have certain glitches. So again, this is the part of the life. Our next program, just to give you some idea, for some information, our next program will be on 3rd July, and that is the strategic relationship between India and Australia. And I will request you all to be present in that program also, and that the details will follow from the institute with the cards and with the timing and other details. Thank you.